You won't believe what happened when the HOA president towed my car. Little did she know, it was an unmarked police vehicle. Before we dive into today's story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so we can keep bringing you amazing stories like this one. It was just another Saturday afternoon in the suburban neighborhood I had recently moved into. I had relocated to this area in hopes of enjoying a quieter, more relaxed lifestyle away from the chaos of the city. The neighborhood was peaceful, lined with tree-filled streets and well-maintained homes, offering the kind of tranquility I was craving. As I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment complex, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction with my new living arrangement. The complex was small enough that I figured it would be easy to get to know the people around me. I parked my car in one of the spaces near the entrance of the building. The lot wasn't huge, and the parking spaces were numbered and labeled. I've been living there for only a few weeks, so I was still familiarizing myself with the layout and rules. As I parked, I noticed several other cars around me. Nothing out of the ordinary. One vehicle in particular, a large HOA, Homeowners Association, truck, caught my attention. It was parked a few spaces down from where I had parked, and I saw a man in the truck talking to someone over by the gate. He wasn't directly involved with me, so I didn't think much of it. To be honest, I didn't even give the HOA truck a second thought. It was just another vehicle in the neighborhood. After I parked, I gathered my things, a couple of grocery bags, and walked toward my apartment building. As I approached the entrance, I saw a woman coming toward me. She was in her late 40s, with sharply styled hair and a stern look on her face. She was wearing a lot of jewelry, too much, in my opinion, and walked with the kind of confidence that indicated she was used to being in control. The woman was carrying a clipboard, and I could tell immediately that she wasn't just anyone. This was the kind of person who wouldn't hesitate to make sure that rules were followed to the letter. As she neared me, she stopped and introduced herself. "Hi, I'm Karen, the HOA president," she said, offering a tight smile. Her voice was clipped, professional, almost too official for someone in the neighborhood. "Do you know about the parking rules around here?" I hadn't seen her before and didn't know what to expect. Still, I didn't want to come off as clueless, so I nodded politely. "I'm still getting familiar with the area. I haven't seen any signs or anything about restricted parking." Karen didn't seem too impressed with my answer. "Well," she said, looking at me through narrowed eyes, "there are rules, and you've parked in a spot that's specifically designated for certain vehicles. We've had issues in the past with people parking in spots they shouldn't be in, and that's why we have a towing policy." Her tone was serious, almost threatening. I felt a knot form in my stomach as she spoke. I hadn't intended to break any rules. I had simply parked in what appeared to be an available space. But now, Karen was laying it out for me like I'd made a serious mistake. I quickly explained. I didn't see any markings or signs indicating any restrictions. I wasn't aware of a policy about specific parking spaces. Karen sighed, clearly impatient. "The spots by your building are for residents with specific permits. You should have received that information when you moved in. As it stands, your car is parked in a spot that it shouldn't be in. I'll be reporting this, and if you don't move it immediately, I will have it towed." Her words made me feel small. I hadn't meant to do anything wrong, and I was getting the sense that she didn't have any intention of giving me a chance to rectify the situation. Instead of being helpful or understanding, she seemed more interested in flexing her authority. Without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing there in confusion. I was left wondering whether I had indeed parked in the wrong spot, and more importantly, what I was supposed to do now. After she left, I looked back at my car, considering my options. I wasn't sure what exactly I had done wrong, but I was starting to feel uneasy. I had seen the HOA truck nearby, and part of me wondered if the driver had something to do with this whole situation. But my bigger concern was whether Karen had the power to follow through on her threat. I pulled out my phone and tried calling the HOA office to clarify the rules, but I got no answer. I left a message asking for clarification on where I was allowed to park. Just as I was about to head inside to do some more research, I heard the rumble of a tow truck pulling up. My heart skipped a beat as I turned around and saw the truck coming toward my car. In that moment, I realized that Karen wasn't kidding. She had already called a tow truck to remove my vehicle. The truck was huge, its hydraulic arms moving with an eerie precision as it positioned itself behind my car. My stomach sank. There was no way this was happening, I thought. I rushed over to the tow truck, hoping I could stop the driver before they actually lifted my car. I tried explaining to the driver that I had only parked there because I didn't know about any restrictions. But the tow truck driver, a burly man with a no-nonsense attitude, wasn't interested in my explanation. "Doesn't matter," he said curtly. "Parking's a violation. If it's not moved, we tow it. No exceptions." I began to feel the weight of the situation. There was no negotiation, no second chances. Before I knew it, my car was already hooked up to the tow truck. I stood there in disbelief as the truck began to slowly pull my car away. I ran after it, waving my arms and shouting, but the driver didn't stop. I felt a wave of panic wash over me as I watched my car disappear around the corner. My car was gone, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I stood frozen in place for a moment, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. I reached for my phone to call the HOA office again, but the number went straight to voicemail. I had no idea what to do next. I finally called the towing company listed on the truck, only to be told that my car had already been taken to the impound lot. They informed me that I would have to pay the towing fees if I wanted to retrieve my car. I was furious, frustrated, and completely helpless. As I stood there, waiting for the inevitable, I began to realize something crucial that I hadn't even thought about at the time. My car wasn't just any ordinary vehicle. It was an unmarked police vehicle. I wasn't just some random person parking illegally. I was an officer who had accidentally parked in a spot that I didn't realize was reserved. But in that moment, Karen and the tow truck driver had no idea about the special status of my vehicle. As I stood there, feeling a mix of helplessness and frustration, it hit me. My car wasn't just any regular car. It was an unmarked police vehicle, a fact I hadn't considered in the heat of the moment. At first, I had been so flustered by Karen's authoritative tone and the tow truck driver's indifferent attitude that I had completely forgotten about the special status of my vehicle. It wasn't just a random sedan. It was a law enforcement vehicle that, while unmarked, still carried all the privileges and protections associated with being a police car. The thought immediately hit me with a fresh wave of panic. If they knew what kind of vehicle it was, they would realize that towing it wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was a serious mistake. I quickly tried to recollect my thoughts and think about my next steps. In my mind, I knew that unmarked police vehicles had specific protections under the law, but the problem was that neither Karen nor the tow truck driver had any way of knowing that. There was nothing outwardly about the car that screamed police vehicle. The sleek, dark-colored sedan blended in with the rest of the cars in the lot. Sure, it had a few hidden lights and sirens, but nothing that was immediately obvious to someone who wasn't familiar with law enforcement vehicles. I pulled my phone from my pocket, dialing the number of the towing company in a state of near panic. I hoped that, by explaining the situation to them, I might be able to stop the tow or at least have my car returned. The phone rang a few times before the receptionist picked up. "Hello, this is the towing company. How may I assist you?" I said, trying to remain calm. "I need to speak to someone about a vehicle that was just towed. It's a police vehicle, and it was parked in an incorrect spot, but there's been a mistake. I need to get it back immediately." The receptionist paused for a moment. "A police vehicle, you say?" she asked, sounding skeptical. "Yes, it's an unmarked police vehicle. I'm an officer, and I accidentally parked in a spot that I didn't realize was restricted. I really need you to understand that this is a mistake, and the car should not have been towed." I tried to explain, but the more I spoke, the more I realized that she wasn't taking me seriously. "Look, ma'am," the receptionist said with a condescending tone, "our policy is clear. If the vehicle is parked in a restricted area, we tow it. It doesn't matter who owns it. You need to come to the impound lot to settle the fees and retrieve your vehicle." I felt my frustration building. I didn't have time to waste on this. My car was taken without consideration, and now they were making me feel as though it didn't matter who I was or what my profession was. I was just another person who had violated the parking rules. "What if I told you it's actually an unmarked police vehicle?" I repeated, trying to emphasize the importance of this information. The receptionist's tone shifted slightly. "You're saying it's a police car, but unless you can prove that, I can't do anything about it. You'll need to bring in proof of ownership." At this point, I was livid. I wanted to argue further, but I realized that arguing with someone over the phone wasn't going to resolve anything. I decided it would be faster to get to the impound lot and show them the proof myself. I thanked the receptionist through gritted teeth and hung up. I made my way to the lot where my car was supposed to be, my mind racing. How had Karen not known what kind of vehicle she was dealing with? Surely, the presence of certain equipment, hidden sirens, lights, and the like, would have been a clue. But then again, unmarked vehicles were designed specifically to blend in, to avoid drawing attention. And in that respect, they had done their job. As I arrived at the towing lot, I was met with the cold, bureaucratic atmosphere of the place. It was nothing but rows upon rows of cars, some with minor fender benders, others with significant damage, all stacked together behind a large metal fence. I could feel my heart racing as I approached the counter inside the lot. The clerk, a bored-looking man in his late 30s, glanced up from his paperwork as I approached. "I'm here to retrieve my vehicle," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It was towed earlier today. I need to speak to someone about the situation." The clerk barely looked up. "Do you have your paperwork or identification?" I nodded, pulling out my badge and showing it to him. "I'm a police officer, and the car that was towed is an unmarked police vehicle. There was some confusion about where I parked, but I need to get my car back." The clerk's eyes widened slightly as he looked at the badge, and for a moment, I thought I might have made some progress. But instead of responding right away, he motioned for me to wait and walked over to another office in the back. He returned after a few minutes with a woman who was dressed in an official-looking uniform. She walked up to the counter and introduced herself as the manager of the impound lot. "I understand you're saying that the car we towed was an unmarked police vehicle?" she asked. Her tone was more professional than the receptionist's, but there was still a trace of skepticism in her voice. "Yes," I said firmly. "It was an honest mistake, but I'm an officer, and I need to get my car back. I'm telling you, it's an unmarked police vehicle. If you run the plate, you'll see." She nodded slowly, clearly processing the situation. "All right, we'll run the plates, but I can't promise anything. If it is a police vehicle, we might be able to make an exception, but there are still fees to pay for the towing." I nodded in agreement, feeling a slight sense of relief. It wasn't much, but at least they were willing to check. A few minutes passed before the woman returned with the news. "Your car checks out. It is, in fact, an unmarked police vehicle." She paused for a moment before adding, "We will release it to you, but there are still towing and impound fees that need to be covered." I sighed in relief, knowing the situation was finally being rectified, but at the same time, I was frustrated. This entire ordeal could have been avoided if Karen had simply taken the time to ask about the vehicle or look a little closer before calling the tow truck. I still had to deal with the fees, but at least I would have my car back. After the ordeal at the impound lot, I was finally able to retrieve my vehicle, but the situation left me with a deep sense of frustration. It wasn't just about the car being towed, the fees, or even a misunderstanding about the parking spot. What truly bothered me was how avoidable this entire mess was. If Karen, the HOA president, had just taken a moment to communicate more effectively, or if she had shown some basic understanding of how things worked, none of this would have escalated to the point where my unmarked police vehicle was towed away. The thought kept running through my mind as I drove back to the apartment complex. The drive back was long and tense, and I found myself replaying the entire situation in my head, analyzing what went wrong at every step. I could still remember the coldness in Karen's voice as she threatened to have my car towed, the complete lack of empathy she showed when I tried to explain myself. I had hoped that when she first approached me, she would have taken the time to explain the situation and ask a few more questions. Instead, she had come at me with an air of superiority, as if I were just another resident breaking the rules without even a second thought. She hadn't even given me a chance to explain before she walked away, leaving me to fend for myself. It was clear to me that Karen wasn't the kind of person who valued communication. To her, it seemed rules were simply about enforcing power, not understanding or cooperation. This was a woman who thought that authority was about making people comply, rather than working with them to find solutions. I couldn't help but think of how much better the situation could have been if she had simply listened, understood the circumstances, and approached it in a more reasonable way. If she had known that I was a police officer If she had known it was an unmarked vehicle, it would have been a whole different story. But Karen never bothered to ask. When I arrived back at the complex, I parked my car in a different spot, far from where I had originally parked. As I walked into the building, I noticed that Karen's truck was still there, parked by the entrance. I thought about going up to her and having a word with her, but the last thing I wanted was to get into another confrontation. As much as I wanted to explain what had happened, I also knew that doing so might just make the situation worse. She had made up her mind, and nothing I said was going to change her attitude. Besides, I was exhausted. I had just spent hours going back and forth with the towing company, dealing with the impound lot, and paying fees I shouldn't have had to pay in the first place. I wasn't in the mood for more drama. A few days passed, and I decided that the best course of action was to write a letter to the HOA board. I drafted a detailed account of the situation, explaining the misunderstanding and how Karen's actions led to unnecessary stress and financial burden. I made sure to keep the tone professional and respectful, but I also made it clear that Karen's handling of the situation was far from ideal. I wanted to make sure they understood that this wasn't just about a parking violation. It was about how things could have been handled better with more understanding and communication. I outlined the facts, including the fact that my car was an unmarked police vehicle and that Karen could have easily avoided the situation by asking a few more questions. When I sent the letter, I wasn't expecting an immediate resolution, but I felt it was important to bring the issue to light. I hoped the HOA board would take my complaints seriously and address Karen's lack of professionalism. But the real issue wasn't just about Karen. It was about the broader culture of communication, or rather the lack thereof, within the HOA. From my experience, it seemed that there was a tendency for HOA members to think they were above reproach, wielding their authority without considering the impact on the residents. It made me question whether this was a common problem in the community or if it was just a flaw in Karen's leadership style. In the following weeks, I noticed a subtle shift in the neighborhood. It wasn't a dramatic change, but there was a noticeable tension that hadn't been there before. I overheard a few neighbors talking about the incident, and they seemed just as frustrated with Karen as I had been. It became clear that I wasn't the only one who had experienced issues with her. Some neighbors even shared stories of her treating them harshly over trivial matters, while others mentioned how she often overlooked complaints or failed to communicate effectively. It wasn't just me. Karen's inability to handle situations with a sense of fairness or diplomacy was beginning to have a ripple effect on the community. A few weeks later, I received a letter from the HOA board in response to my complaint. The letter was polite but somewhat non-committal, stating that they had reviewed the situation and would be addressing it internally. They acknowledged my concerns, but didn't offer any specific solutions or changes. While I appreciated the acknowledgement, I couldn't help but feel that the letter was more about damage control than actually addressing the root of the problem. There was no apology for the way I had been treated, and no recognition that Karen's actions had been overly harsh and unnecessary. Instead, the board reassured me that they would continue to enforce the rules, without addressing the fact that Karen had enforced them in a way that lacked understanding or flexibility. At this point, I realized that change wasn't going to come easily. The HOA was set in its ways, and Karen was still firmly in control of the board. But the situation had taught me an important lesson. Communication, particularly in communities where people are expected to follow rules and regulations, is key to maintaining harmony. Rules are important, but how they are enforced and how residents are treated matters just as much. I had learned that sometimes people in positions of power can let their authority go to their heads, forgetting that a little compassion and understanding can go a long way in resolving conflicts. In the end, the entire ordeal became a learning experience for me. While I was able to get my car back, the situation highlighted how important it is to be aware of the nuances in communication, both as a resident and as someone with authority. If Karen had taken a moment to ask questions, if she had communicated more effectively, none of this would have happened. But now, I could only hope that the HOA would eventually realize that enforcing rules with a heavy hand, without regard for context, wasn't the best approach. I knew that change was unlikely to happen overnight, but I had made my voice heard, and that, at least, felt like a small victory.